Marriage is a commitment born on the wings of love that embraces the whole person, our warts and all, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health. But at a time when commitment levels are so low and failure rates are so high, we really need to be proactive about protecting our marriages and looking at them from a biblically based, hope-filled perspective. That's why today we are talking about the keys to long-term marital success and happiness. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I'm grateful when you choose to spend a few minutes of your week with us. Today, we're going to be talking about keys to long-term marital success and happiness. And joining me on the episode today is Dr. Gary Lovejoy, who is the author of Marriages in the Bible. What do they tell us? Dr. Lovejoy earned his doctorate from United States International University. He was in private practice in professional counseling for over 40 years, specializing in marriage counseling and in the treatment of anxiety disorders and depression. He's authored several books on topics such as depression and anxiety, and he combines his abiding faith, deep concern, and counseling acumen to guide marriages to work as God intended. Welcome to the program, Dr. Lovejoy.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking me on.
You say in your book that marriage is a complex union. Will you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, it's a complex union partly because when two people marry, they're bringing their histories with them, and as a result of that, there can be a lot of unexpected and unanticipated conflicts that they have to work through. And part of the process of marriage really is unpacking those differences and openly doing so. And I think that's part of what courtship is for, but oftentimes that's carried right on into the marriage because oftentimes when you're living with some certain things come out that didn't come out before. And so it requires a great deal of humility and openness and transparency in the marriage in order to really deal with those because as long as things are not faced, they're not solved. They have to be faced in order to be resolved.
Well,
And,
that's
uh, and so that kind of transparency is required to deal with the complexities that they'll discover when they get married. Two people, a human being is a very complex human a person anyway, and they have so many aspects in terms of their functioning. But when you have two of them together, you multiply that. It's multiplicative, it's not additive.
that's for sure. Who's the first person in the marriage to sound the alarm to trouble and why?
Usually, and I found over the 40 years of practice that it's usually the woman who sounds the alarm. She's usually more sensitive to the issues going on. Oftentimes, the female is often raised to be more sensitive to relational issues. Men sometimes are involved in their work and their careers and all the rest, and may not be as aware of that. And so women become increasingly unhappy, and then and the men become unhappy because the wives as they get unhappy, they become critical and argumentative and begin to take them to task for all sorts of different things, sometimes unreasonably so, but that's because of their level of dissatisfaction and happiness. And the man feels like the attack is on his adequacy as a man and as a husband, and that's why they often will say things like, "I never do anything right. No matter what I do, it's wrong," and they're feeling like they have no ability to relate to their wives, and so they feel alienated, and therefore, and they tend to withdraw rather than be proactive and address it. They'll tend to withdraw. That makes her feel even more lonely. In fact, oftentimes in counseling, I would say, "How are you feeling lonely?" I just mention that word, and tears come running down their faces because they are excruciatingly lonely. But they handle their loneliness in a way that doesn't help them. And that's part of counseling, is, of course, trying to identify what's helpful and what's not. And it's not helpful because they serve to further alienate their husbands and they get even more loneliness. And then they're both unhappy. But it's usually the woman It used to be in in the ancient world, in the biblical world, the men, it was a male-dominated society, so men initiated all divorces. Women rarely did, and they did some, but life as a single woman in an ancient society was difficult, very difficult. And so they were very hesitant to do so. Today it's very different because women often work and they often make more, sometimes even make more money than their husbands, and they have the wherewithal to survive quite nicely on their own. So therefore, they're not as hesitant to file for divorce. And women are more often, about 70% of divorces are initiated by women.
You say that aggressiveness and passivity are both a cover for fear. What do you mean?
Well, because when we're fearful, we have different possible reactions. Sometimes when we're fearful, we lash out because because we think that aggression will protect us. And this is particularly true for men, but it's also true for women too. Um, but they'll lash out in various ways of being angry. Sometimes, sadly enough, it can even lead to physical, spousal abuse. And or they may, in their fear, may withdraw. They just say, "I'm afraid to talk. I'm afraid to share. I'm afraid to open." Sometimes they come from families where they were very closed families. No one talked about anything. All issues and conflicts were simply buried, and that becomes their MO. And so they do the same thing, not realizing that that's simply alienating their spouse because then their spouse feels like I'm left out of this relationship. And so they try even more vigorously to get to break into that, and they see that as more threatening, and they withdraw even more. It's a very difficult interplay of dynamics that serve to make it harder rather than easier to resolve whatever is going on between them.
It sounds like a vicious cycle that just snowballs the longer it's left to go on.
Absolutely.
Would you talk for a moment about the role of humility in opening the door for reconciliation?
That's a great question. Humility is often misunderstood. I look at humility in terms of the ability to understand who we are and who God is and the difference between the two.
Mm.
And that there is an inextricable relationship between humility and self-esteem. People who have low self-esteem, we think of, oh, they're humble. You know, they're always putting themselves down. That's not humility. Actually, humility requires self-esteem. The two are so closely related because in effect, what we're saying in terms of humility is that, and if I look at it from a biblical standpoint, it's like we have a sense of self-worth affirmed in Christ and a sense of empowerment by the power of the Holy Spirit. So in that sense, it leads to proactive behavior. And so humility is an opportunity to recognize that I'm here to serve you. If you're my wife, I'm here to serve you. And the wife is to serve her husband. In fact, that's exactly how Paul stated that in the book of Ephesians, that we serve one another. And one of the things that is often misunderstood in this in Ephesians 5 passage is it says that the man is the head of the wife. Oh man, that hits a nerve for a lot of people. Say, what do you mean? A man's the head of the wife? Is he the dictator? And the answer is no, because what it says is he is the head of the wife as what? Christ is the head of the church. Well, how was Christ the head of the church? He served the church to his death on the cross. So it was the ultimate sacrifice. He gave everything for the church. And that service was humility. And so what Paul was saying is that the husband must be humble enough to serve his wife and to love her, and the wife is to in turn serve her husband, and by serving, loving and serving are two sides of the same coin. If you love them, you want to serve them. If you and as you serve them, you love them more, and so there's a reciprocity there. But that's the nature of humility, and it's essential for a good, strong marriage. Because if you don't serve one another, you don't respect each other. And if you don't respect each other, you don't have the kind of intimacy that can otherwise be possible.
I think that's a very valuable point. It comes out of respect.
Yes, it does.
Friends, we're going to take a real short commercial break, but I want you to stick with us. So, when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Dr. Lovejoy about the keys to long-term marital success and happiness. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your Hope-Filled Perspective, where today we are talking with Dr. Gary Lovejoy, author of Marriages in the Bible. Today we're talking about long-term marital success and happiness. Dr. Lovejoy, why do you believe protecting one's marriage from assaults on its integrity is paramount to preserving it?
Well, one of the things that, in fact, one of the marriages in the Bible, well, two of them actually, both Abraham and Isaac, um, that they did not protect their wives. When they were afraid of their own lives, what did they do? They pushed their wives in front and said, "Here, take her." And I've often said when I've been speaking to groups, I said, "How would you like it?" I addressed the women in the audience and said, "How would you like it if your husband, you're walking down the street and some dicey looking guy is coming the other direction and he's getting worried, and so he shoves you in front of him and says, 'Here, take her, spare me.'" He said, I don't think you'd be too happy with that response." And they get universal agreement on that one. But that's exactly what Abraham did and his son Isaac. Apple didn't fall far from the tree. But what that does is it produces, if we're not protective of our wives, and by protective today, we don't mean it in the same sense that Abraham did it, but although we might, but more it's protecting them against the negative reactions, often to family members that might put them down. And you are always there to protect your wife, and you take your wife's side, you don't take your parents' side. I've seen too many marriages where I'll give an example. One man who came in, man and wife came in, and she was ready she was on the brink of divorce. I mean, she was ready to file, and and I said, what kind of problems are going on? And she said, "Well, his family hates me." Now, the fact is, there was a symbiotic relationship between mom and dad and son. They were very close, and the wife was seen as an interloper between them. And so the parents had made a pact to continuously assault the wife verbally. They would criticize her, they would put her down, they would ignore her in large gatherings, they never even introduce her. I mean, she was a persona non grata in his family. And so she would go to her husband and say, "Do something about this. I hate going to any family get together." And and he would say, "Oh, you know them. Just let it slough off your back. Don't worry about it. That's just them." And so he was putting it away because he didn't want to deal with it. He didn't want to deal with it with his own parents. And when it really came down to a push comes to shove, he would side with his parents. His wife felt totally betrayed. And and so there is a perfect example that he never protected his wife, never, and she felt completely vulnerable, and consequently felt unloved. People who don't feel protected by the one that they marry do not feel loved by that person. You say, "Well, I don't want to go out in the bars or go out and mix with other people or go party, or I don't do any of those things. I'm at home. I do all." But that's not the issue. The issue is how valuable does your wife feel in your presence? And she felt no value at all. Therefore, she felt unloved. And so it invalidated all of the statements of love he would make. And because she knew when it came down to it, he would side with his parents, not her. And it sometimes goes the other direction. It's the wife who's doing that. But either one, that is great. That decimates a relationship.
You talk about the family as being, I love this term, incubator of bad habits. What
Mhm.
do you mean by that?
Well, what we learn and how to resolve conflict is we watch how it's done in home. The only models we have are the ones that we're at home. We don't live with anybody else. We just live with our parents and our families. And if what goes on at home, if mom and dad don't talk to each other, or they have arguments and never resolve them, or they yell at each other constantly, or they withdraw, maybe dad withdraws or mom withdraws, and there's a cold atmosphere, and that's how they handle every conflict, and then eventually wears off, and then the next day it's okay. That's how they learn to resolve conflict. And so when they go into their marriages, they know nothing different. And so they walk in and they're handling conflict the way their family always is. And the shock is that when they handle the conflict that way, it isn't received in the same way it was received in the family of origin. All of a sudden, if a husband is used to a certain kind of ways of dealing with conflict in his family, and he tries that in his new marriage, and she comes from a family where everybody talked about everything and dealt with all the conflicts, and then he feels like, oh my gosh, she wants to talk about everything. We can't do that. And uh, and so now there's an immediate conflict between the two of them. And sometimes that happens very early on in marriage. Sometimes very young marriages are struggling for that very reason because there's a clash between the kinds of ways that people dealt with conflict and dealt with their relationship and how they expressed love and when they talk about love language, how is that expressed in that family and so forth. And it can be very different in different families. And so when they come together, that's what part of what we talked about earlier about complexity. They bring these tendencies into the relationship and they match. They're trying to mesh them, but they oftentimes conflict. And that's part of the early growth demands of marriage is how do we make those fit in a way that I become more transparent, you become more forgiving. That's something.
So it's fair to say then transparency is the hallmark of a good marriage.
Absolutely. If we're not transparent, there's no way we can deal with the issues. Uh, you know, issues don't go away simply by ignoring them. And a lot of people handle them that way. They just hope they'll go away and they ignore them. But conflict is not a bad thing. We think conflict, oh, that's a bad thing, but I don't view it as a bad thing. I view it as opportunities for growth. Because if there are sometimes couples who actually succeed in becoming clones of each other because they both fear conflict. So they cover over their differences and they come in and their whole marriage is a pretense. And it's not satisfying. You say, well, why are they there? You know what their most common complaint is under those conditions? They come because they seem to be very civil with each other, very nice, and everything seems to be calm. There doesn't seem to be wild fights or anything. So you say, what's going on? What's happening? And say, well, basically we're just trying to look for some more excitement in our relationship. We're not sure what's wrong with our relationship. There's something missing. And what they're missing is that what they're basically telling me is they're bored. And they're bored is because if my wife is a clone of me, then I lose my interest in the relationship. Our interest is determined by her differences from me. If we succeed in masking all those differences, then I don't need to talk to you because I already know me. And if you're just talking about you have the same ideas and same thoughts and same expressions and everything as I do, then I don't need to talk to you. I already know me. And so I lose interest in the relationship. The interest value in the relationship is what suffers the most when in non-transparent relationships. We get married. First we fall in love, and that love is a powerful emotion inside. But in order to maintain the tenacity of that love, our spouses must remain interesting to us, and they're only interesting if they are exposing and sharing their differences. If everybody agrees with everything, then it's very boring, and that's what happens. And the relationship is then not satisfying for a different reason.
So then we could look at conflict as an opportunity to see each other's differences and learn how to work with our differences. Talk
Exactly. That's where growth comes from.
talk about the role of problem solving in a healthy marriage.
Well, when it comes to problem solving, the worst thing to do, and which most couples do, is it starts out with an accusation. If you make an accusation, you're almost certainly going to get a defensive response. And once you get a defensive response, then you will be defensive in reciprocation. Pretty soon it's just out of control and nothing gets solved and they walk away angry and unhappy. And so the first thing that's important resolving conflict is to come at it not from an accusation point of view, but talking about how can we make things better. There's some things that I'm not sure how to handle well, and so I thought if we can sit down and talk about it, that maybe we can figure out a better way to handle it. Now it's a we thing, not a you thing. Once you make it a you thing, it's an accusation. If it's a we thing, then and in every marriage you say, well, it's not, I'm not at fault. My spouse is at fault. You say, no, in every conflict, each person is doing something wrong. Even if you think you are the one who's the victim, it's how you respond as a victim that may be part of the problem. So, so anytime I was working, when I worked with couples, I always talked about how they can adjust each other's roles and how they can see that they have some things to do to grow in this relationship just as much as their partner does. So it's a reciprocal thing. And if conflicts are viewed as unilateral, then they're never solved. They just become hardened in their position. And so you have to have that, not only that transparency, but to come at those conflicts with the idea that we can solve them. That all we need to do is talk about, we're rational human beings, we can figure this out. We can come at it in a different way. And sometimes it means the sensitive area of identifying certain things we've learned at home, in our homes of origin, which have sensitized us to certain issues. I remember in one couple, the woman would just immediately disappear at a certain times in their marriage, and he resented that because he felt like, "What's wrong with me?" And what she admitted to later, she's in my family when he had a certain characteristic. I won't go into all of the details of it, but he had a certain way of responding that was reminiscent of someone in her family that had abused her. And so it was terrifying. And she'd never shared this with him, but instead, when he would respond that way, she would just disappear, almost as out of self-protection. But he saw it as rejection. But for her, self-protection. When they started talking about it, how, from a point of view, how can we make it better? She confessed that that's how she felt. He had no idea. And he was more than happy to change that. Had to work on it, but he was more than happy to change it when he realized what impact it was having. But he had no idea. And so there was an interaction pattern that was highly toxic, but it was toxic unbeknownst to him and incredibly well known to her. And so they were able to resolve that. In fact, she felt more deeply loved that he was willing to hear what she had to say and willing to make change so that it wouldn't trigger her.
And right there is the value of therapy,
Mhm.
because here they had been interacting this way for a very long time, neither one really aware of how they were impacting the other one. But
Exactly.
therapy provides that opportunity for that outside perspective.
Mhm.
Dr. Lovejoy, why do you say that love is not enough to marry or to keep a marriage together?
Well, apart from God's love, which is indestructible, our love is destructible. That's the difference between our love and God's love. Our love needs to be constantly cultivated. You cannot just say, "Well, we're in love, we got married, and so forth." And I've often heard men say things like, and sometimes women too, but particularly men, will say things like, "Well, they know I love her. She knows I love her. I mean, I don't go out on her. I sometimes bring her flowers. I do different things. She knows I love her. I don't have to tell her." And I say, "Oh, yes, you do, because they need to hear it. They need to have it demonstrated, but they need to hear it too." And and I think part of it too is the element of surprise. I think this is one of the most neglected aspects of marriage, is that people get into deadening patterns that just that dull the relationship, and or they or maybe destroy the relationship. Very deadening patterns, and they become routinized in their marriage. And so to shake that up with some surprise at times. I remember I shared that with a man whose relationship, marriage and with his wife was not the best, and he wanted to make it better. And kudos for him that he want that. And so I introduced the idea of an element of surprise, and he, on his own, he went home and and told his wife the next day to just dress up and when I come home, I'll pick you up. He was going to change into better clothes after work and pick her up. He did so, and he went around and they reenacted their entire first date. All the places, unfortunately, were still there, and they went to all the different places, ended up in a park where they talked for hours, which is what they did on their first date. And she didn't stop talking about that for 3 weeks, and she was telling everybody, "Oh, God, I got to tell you what my husband did." And and he came back and counseling. He said, "I never knew." That all I had to do is shake things up, do things a little differently, introduce us to surprise, which this was, and she's talking about it for weeks. I'm a hero, and so he had learned how to inject a stimulus into his marriage. I wish we had the time. I would share an example of a conflict that was resolved by the same issue. I don't know if we have time for that or not. Probably not. But oh, I can try. Um, there was a couple came in. They were actually the woman came in by herself, and she said, "My husband and I argue every single night, and blowouts. I mean, complete blowouts every single night." And how long has this been going on? 3 years. I didn't. I say congratulations on your your stamina to last for 3 years and arguing like that. And her husband had a job he hated, and he comes home and he's in a bad mood, and he would trigger a argument. And I said, well, what would happen when he would come home and start in on you? Well, I'm no wallflower. I struck back and I fought back, and we would have these knockdown, drag out verbal battles. And I said, so do you think then after a while your husband would know pretty much how you're going to respond? Oh, yeah, he knows exactly how I respond. And you know how he's going to respond probably when he comes home, right? Oh, I absolutely know how I'm prepared. I'm ready for bear. And I said, the problem with your marriage is just too predictable. And she looked at me like I was drunk off. And I said, what do you mean too predictable? You're too predictable. He knows what you're going to respond, and you know how he's going to respond, and you're already prepared. I said, here's what I want you to do. Once you go home, on the way home, buy a water pistol and fill it with water and put it in your purse. The next time he comes in and he starts in on you, instead of responding the way you normally respond, reach in, grab your water pistol, shoot him with the water pistol, and run out of the room giggling. Do you think you can do that? He said, yeah. Do you think that would be unexpected? Oh, yeah, it would be very unexpected. So I said, well, try that and see what happens. And so she did. She came back this time with her husband. And they said, well, what happened? And she said, well, did what you asked. And so I went home and I went and got a water pistol, filled it with water, and I squirted him. And I said, she said, I ran out of the room giggling, but I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. I wanted to see how he was responding. And he said he was standing there, his mouth hanging open with water dripping off the end of his nose, wondering, what is that all about? But she said, but it stopped the argument. And then she did it. The next night he came home the same way, happened again. She squirted him again. The same thing happened. Third night, came home. It started to happen again. She pulled out her pistol to squirt him, and she was staring down the barrel of his water pistol. And they had an old-fashioned water pistol fight, running all over the house, squirting each other until they were soaked to death. And they fell on the living room floor and were laughing like two teenagers, laughing their heads off. And they looked at each other suddenly, and when they looked at each other, they said, you know, this is the first time we've laughed in 3 years. First time we've laughed. And he says, and they got one of the things that attracted them to each other was the fact that they had they loved to laugh, they loved to have fun, and their fun was gone in their relationship. And now they had this water pistol fight through the house, and they were soaking wet and laughing. And it's the first time they sat up right there, still wet, and they had a really serious conversation about what they wanted to change in their marriage. And their marriage turned out, and to make a long story short, it turned out to be a fantastic marriage. And they completely revolutionized, but it started with a surprise move, something that broke the mesmerizing influence of the same pattern over and over and over. It was repeated with deadening accuracy. And so once it was changed, it shook things up and it began moving things in a different direction. So to protect, to be transparent, to always remember to be loving with each other, and the way you frame things to your partner. If you have a complaint, you frame it. The frame is very important. Um, the if, I used to go to and visit these art auctions where they just have, and you look at, I watched them operate, and somebody would look, a couple would look at a painting and think, oh, that's okay, but I'm not sure quite, and they weren't sure. So the guy would go out and say, what is the kind of furniture you have? What style do you like? Oh, we like Victorian. Oh, okay. He runs over and gets another frame, puts it on the painting. They go, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. And they bought the picture. Why? Because it was how it was framed that made the difference. And that's exactly how it is in terms of our interactions with each other, is how we frame them. If we frame them in terms of accusation or throwing down the gauntlet, that's what we're going to get, an argument. But if we frame it as an invitation to grow, as an invitation to make things better for each other, which is itself an invitation to love, is going to then be a different frame that's going to be attractive, and you're going to buy into it. And so that's what happens in the element of bringing not only surprise into the relationship, but also that kind of reassurance that I have your best interest in mind, and I trust that you have mine in mind. And when we act and when we respond that way, we begin to see a Christ-centered marriage, because that's how Jesus expressed his love to even his opponents, even those who hated him. He never tried to humiliate them or tried to. They humiliated themselves sometimes, but he never tried to put them down. He never had shouting matches with any of the Pharisees. He always calmly spoke to them, but gave them the truth, speaking the truth in love. And that is the model for us as believers as we relate to each other.
Such good insight and wisdom. And as I was thinking through your recap of the tips and tools that are so important if we want a successful marriage, I think they all come back to respect,
Yes, they do.
showing love and respect. And
Mhm.
Christ always showed respect to those that he was interacting with.
Exactly.
Dr. Lovejoy, thank you for being on this episode. I appreciate your wisdom and your suggestions. Friends, I hope that there was something that you found encouraging in today's episode. Perhaps you're going to go into your marriage thinking about how you can interject the element of surprise. Or
Mhm.
maybe you'll approach difficulties from the standpoint of this is a problem that we can solve together. Whatever it is, I hope that you have found that this episode encourages you. And if you know somebody who's in need of a little bit of encouragement in their marriage, consider sharing this episode with them. Friends, we'll be together again next week with another biblically based, hope filled perspective. Until then, it's my prayer for you that you have a hope filled week.